welcome to the John Carter Brown Library. I'm Karen Wolf, and the director and the librarian, and I'm so pleased to have you all here this evening for a very special event. It's special to me for lots of reasons. I want to take a moment before we begin tonight just to recognize that members of the JCB's Board of Visitors are with us this evening in advance of one of their 3 times a year meetings. Tomorrow, the JCB board works so hard on behalf of the library. I'm truly grateful for their support, their expertise, their enthusiasm, and honestly, their ability to kind of keep us on track. Very, very helpful. I also want to recognize the JCB staff as we end a kind of intense year of programming. We're not completely over, honestly. Our year actually ends June 30th formally, and we've got a ways to go. But I just want to recognize how extraordinarily hard the JCB staff works to bring off any single event that we produce, and how it draws on every single corner of the library to create an event like this. So you may notice that we have copies of the Declaration of Independence, which Dr. Sneff is going to talk about shortly. Here, in addition to what's in our exhibit, we also have things on the table here. And that's an example of how that required specialist cataloging over the last year. Not all of our copies of the Declaration had been fully cataloged, actually. Our digitization team, our conservation team, which actually produced those supports for tonight, within the last week. It requires coordination of all kinds to actually get those portable vitrines up here, not to mention all of the work of communications and managing the production of catering, getting chairs set, all of these things. It's an incredible full team event, and I'm just incredibly grateful to the best staff. So in addition to my role at the library, I'm also the co-chair for Brown 2026, the university-wide initiative to mark the semi-quincentennial of the United States. And I hope after the talk, you'll take a moment not only to see the materials that we've put out on the tables, but also to see the exhibit 1776 Across the Americas, which I co-curated with our postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Kathleen Towling, which is part of the JCB's focus for the semi-quincentennial, and which also has important collaborative resonance with Brown 2026. So turning to tonight's speaker, Emily Sneff, we are here to hear some of the research from her book, When the Declaration of Independence Was News, which was just published by Oxford University Press like minutes ago. All right, I think it was last month, but Dr. Sneff earned her PhD in history from William & Mary in January of 2024, although she defended it right in this very room. True story. She also holds an MA from William & Mary and a BA in history from Johns Hopkins University. Emily is currently a consulting curator for museum exhibitions for the 250th in various places, including the Museum of the American Revolution and also Historic Trap. She was also, I think it's important to note, an integral part of the Declaration Resources Project at Harvard University, led by Dr. Danielle Allen, which won international recognition for, among other things, locating and identifying a second parchment copy of the Declaration in a rather obscure, at least to me, local British archive. And that work continues to be important, continues to be referenced. In fact, somebody just this morning said to me, I just read about this amazing project. And I was like, that is Emily too, because I was talking to them about Emily. Anyway, her work has earned her many accolades, including a fellowship right here at the JCB and at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies. She is, as you can imagine, extremely busy this year, packed full of speaking dates and podcast interviews and conferences to expand the reach of her research and expertise. It's truly such a pleasure to have Emily here with us this evening.
Thank you, Karen. I am so happy to be at the JCB. This is a place that has some of the best people and some of the best documents. So I'm very thrilled to be here. I've actually been in Rhode Island this whole week for Rhode Island Independence Day, but not really, I'm sorry. But I'm so pleased to be able to share some of my research with you all. And for those of you in the room, you'll be able to see some of the specific copies that I will talk about in my presentation and that are also featured in the book. And those of you who are watching this program, I hope you have the opportunity to come and visit the JCB and see the amazing exhibition curated by Karen and Katie, and all of the wonderful collections that are also available online. I like to begin, though, with these sort of stereotypical images of the Declaration of Independence. As Karen mentioned, I have been on the road quite a bit, even just since April 15th when the book came out. And I like this as a starting point, because when I mention Declaration of Independence, typically one or both of these images will pop into people's minds. On the left, you can see the signed parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence. And on the right, you can see John Trumbull's painting, Declaration of Independence. These are two very clean, very seemingly easy to understand images. You'll see them on movie posters, on book covers, including my own. You'll see the Declaration font a lot this year for the 250th. But both of these images are, to an extent, lies. Let me explain. So first off, I said that this was the signed parchment. It is not. The actual signed parchment, which you can see on the right, and I promise that is a high-resolution image, that is the parchment in the rotunda of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. It has seen its fair share of wear and tear over the years, to the point that the ink is just not legible anymore. But even by the 1820s, the parchment had begun to fade. And so by order of John Quincy Adams, then Secretary of State, the engraving, which you see on the left, was created, done by a handwriting expert who was able to exactly copy both the handwritten text and the signatures at the bottom. So it is as close to an exact facsimile, approximating what the parchment would have looked like when it was first signed as we can get. And that's why it's the more recognizable image. Now, if we think about the parchment, and I'm using the engraving here so we can actually see it, at the top of the parchment, it has the date July 4th, 1776. And this tends to lead to people saying, especially as we approach the 250th, that the Declaration was signed on the 4th of July. It was not. The parchment copy did not exist on that date. And in fact, the Congress's attention was focused on publishing the news of independence. And then they turned their attention to signing later in the month. So this date is very misleading. Additionally, at the bottom of the document, there are 56 signatures representing 56 men who were never in the same room at the same time. Men, including delegates who voted for independence, delegates who voted against independence, and delegates who were not even members of the Continental Congress on the 4th of July. If we actually take a look at what the parchment would have looked like when signing began on August 2nd, that's the day that the parchment was ready to be signed, you can see I've crossed off the names of the men who were not in the room. And for the most part, the names that were added days, if not weeks or months, and in some cases years later, those names have been added at the bottom of the state delegations. The one exception you might notice is in the column under John Hancock. You can see the Virginia delegation. At the top of the Virginia delegation, we have the signatures of George Wythe and Richard Henry Lee. Neither man was in Philadelphia on August 2nd, and so that means that the first Virginian to sign on that date was Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson literally put author of the Declaration of Independence on his tombstone. He was very proud of this fact, and yet in 1776, he left room above his name for these elder statesmen and in some ways mentors of his to sign when they returned to Philadelphia later in the summer. It's an aspect of Jefferson's sort of thought about the Declaration that has not been previously explored. As for this image, John Trumbull worked on this painting over the course of decades, trying to collect all of the necessary portraits. It's an admirable effort. And if Trumbull came close to depicting any singular moment, it would be June 28th. That's the day when the Committee of Five, the drafting committee of the Declaration of Independence, you can see in the foreground of this painting, presented their draft to John Hancock, who's seated, in anticipation of the debate about whether or not to declare independence, resuming on the following Monday, July 1st. There had been a 3-week postponement. July 1st was when they were expected to pick the conversation back up. So if you see memes that say, July 3rd, Thomas Jefferson, oh crap, that's due tomorrow, it's not quite accurate. They actually were ahead of schedule. But again, if this is June 28th, then the image presents some problems. If we zoom into the front left corner of the painting, you can see that George Wythe and Richard Henry Lee have literal front row seats in Trumbull's depiction. Neither man was in the room. So just starting off, we've got some problems. And then towards the back, looking up at an angle, you can see Charles Carroll, one of Maryland's delegates, remembered as being the only Catholic signer, but also the longest lived signer. He outlived both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And Charles Carroll was elected to the Continental Congress on July 4th. So he was not in the room on June 28th. I start with these images to suggest to you all one of the premises of the book, which is that publishing the news of independence to the world was messy work. And I remember way back in my dissertation prospectus talking to Karen about the word messy. And she said, I don't know about the word messy. But here's what I mean by messy. 2 senses of the word. First, material messiness. There's a reason why there's ink splatters on the cover of the book. There are dingy pieces of paper, ink splatters, fingerprints, offsetting of ink, typos. We'll talk about typos today. All sorts of materiality in terms of messiness. But then also messy communication, less efficient communication than you would assume for a document as pivotal as the Declaration of Independence. And so I hope to give you a sense of some of that messiness today. The timeline of the book is pretty short. It literally does what the title says. It focuses on this period of time when the Declaration of Independence was news, which for me stretches from May 1776 to January 1777. And the reason for this is that in May, the Continental Congress issued a resolution which was perceived by many people to be a Declaration of Independence. So the clock kind of starts ticking then. And then the book stretches through the summer and fall, all the way to January 1777, and a particular printing of the Declaration, which marks the transition from news to archival treasure, the way we think about the Declaration today. So the document that the Continental Congress issues on May 15th is a resolution recommending that each of the colonies should establish new representative governments as makes sense for their particular situations. In some cases, colonies had already taken this step. The resolution was pretty even-keeled. Then they added a preamble to it, and John Adams took credit for writing that. And it was the first time that the Continental Congress actually blamed King George III for what the colonists were enduring. Previously, they had been petitioning the king. Now they were blaming the king. And so that's why this resolution was perceived by both members of the Continental Congress and people outside the doors of Independence Hall as a declaration of independence from British rule. Here you can see 2 documents, one of which is in the room with us. But on the left, you can see this tiny, tiny piece of paper, a printing of the May 15th resolution, pasted into the records of the British Consul General in Lisbon, in Portugal. This piece of paper traveled the Atlantic from Philadelphia to Lisbon on a boat called the Rachel. And when the Rachel arrived in Lisbon, the British Consul General had been looking for a reason to ban these rebel ships from Portuguese ports, and he found it with this piece of paper. So he sort of whispered in the ear of the Portuguese court and recommended that this was a declaration of independence, and Portugal, being centuries-long allies with Great Britain, should respond. And so the document you see on the right, a broadside copy of which is here at the JCB, is an edict issued by King Jose I, banning American ships from all Portuguese ports on the basis of this May 15th resolution. And what's particularly interesting about this edict is that it is dated July 4th. Now, this is a pure coincidence of transatlantic communication times, But even diplomats who were well aware of how long it took for information to cross the Atlantic, even for them, they thought it was suspicious that Portugal issued this edict as if they had advanced knowledge that the Declaration of Independence would happen that day. So it's a fascinating document, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Did I expect to have Portuguese in my book about the Declaration of Independence? No, but I'm very glad it's in there. Now, on that same day, May 15th, in Williamsburg, Virginia, the Virginia Convention issued another pivotal resolution. They sent new instructions to their delegates in the Continental Congress to propose three things: independence, confederation among the colonies, and a plan for treaties with foreign powers. I like to think of this as a to-do list. This is the Continental Congress's to-do list. And this is the order in which the things appeared within the instructions. It's not necessarily the order in which things needed to happen. And so there was actually quite a bit of debate among the delegates in Philadelphia about which should come first: independence, confederation, or foreign treaties. And so some of the men who we remember as being against independence, people like John Dickinson, I would argue were actually against independence first out of this list. They're thinking critically about, well, shouldn't we have a confederation, something tying all of the colonies together before we separate from Great Britain? Shouldn't we let France know that we are planning on declaring independence before we actually do so? So these three documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Model Treaty, which could be applied to different nations, were all being drafted simultaneously, and they were being thought of as intrinsically connected. We don't think of them that way today, and the reason for that is that they all happened at different moments. So the Declaration ultimately happened first. The Model Treaty was ready later in 1776, but the first treaties were not enacted until 1778. And then the Articles of Confederation took the longest because of the need for ratification, ultimately didn't work, and that's why the Declaration sits alongside the US Constitution in the National Archives. So this to-do list sort of lost its sense along the way, but at the time, if we think back to 1776, these three things were being thought of together. And the reason why I mention this is because the Declaration wasn't meant to do everything. These other documents were meant to serve their own purposes. And so the Declaration, to my view, is a press release. The Continental Congress made the decision to declare independence. They voted to do so on July 2nd, and then they turned their attention to the press release, the explanation of their decision. This is the first printing of the Declaration created by John Dunlap, a Northern Irish immigrant printer in Philadelphia. He worked the night of July 4th through the day of July 5th, probably printed a few hundred of these broad-sized, poster-sized sheets. And these were meant to be distributed through official channels to each of the states, to the Army, but delegates also sent them to their friends and family members. Just to orient you to how the text looks on Dunlap's broadside, the first two paragraphs are the preamble, and that's where all the parts of the Declaration we know today are found. They're right up front. All men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. First two paragraphs. Then the part of the Declaration that we don't know today takes up the bulk of the text, the list of grievances about King George III. And then the final paragraph is the actual Declaration of Independence. That's where we have the resolution marking this transition from dependent British colonies to the free and independent United States. Everything that comes before that final paragraph is optional. It is a structure which Thomas Jefferson created. And so we can give him credit for that because this begins a genre of documents. The Declaration could have looked very differently, but because it looked like this, other nations, when they declare independence, use this structure of a preamble of natural rights, list of grievances about tyrannical rule, and a final declaration. So it's a really important sort of form that we tend to take for granted, that the Declaration was always going to look that way. These Dunlap broadsides were used for the first public readings of the Declaration of Independence, beginning in the greater Philadelphia area on Monday, July 8th. And the reading that gets the most attention is the one that happened outside of Independence Hall. The reader for that event was John Nixon, who you can see here. It should have been the sheriff of Philadelphia County, but for whatever reason, he gave the responsibility to Nixon, who was the colonel of a battalion of Pennsylvania Associators, militiamen. John Adams said that John Nixon had a really annoying voice. So it's possible that that's why he had this responsibility. You know, in the time before amplification, you kind of want the guy with the annoying voice to be doing the public readings. But when we think about these public readings, we tend to focus on the reader, right? There's newspaper accounts and diary accounts, and they always mention who was doing the reading. And sometimes they'll give vague estimates of crowd size. For the event outside of Independence Hall, accounts differed whether it was hundreds or thousands of people in attendance. But we tend not to think about the audience, the people who were listening as the Declaration was read aloud. And the reading outside of Independence Hall presents an interesting reminder because one of the people in the crowd was James Forten. And if you take a look at his dates, you will notice he was a child. He was 9 years old when he heard the Declaration read. And he went on to become one of the most successful Black entrepreneurs in Philadelphia, a leading abolitionist. And he thought back on this moment of hearing the Declaration read aloud for the first time, and you can see how it influenced his lifelong trajectory. So we have to assume that there were other children in the crowds. There were other free Black people. There were women. There were enslaved people. There were indentured people. In the case of the reading outside Independence Hall, at the other end of the block was Walnut Street Jail. So there were prisoners within earshot of the Declaration. It's hard to recover those experiences, but it's worthwhile to try. Another reading that happened on July 8th on the other side of the Delaware River was in Trenton, New Jersey, where not only the Declaration was read aloud, but also the New Jersey Constitution, which had been agreed to on July 2nd. Now, what's interesting about the New Jersey Constitution is that the final provision said that if we reconcile with Great Britain, this entire document is null and void. So you can imagine the cognitive dissonance of hearing the Declaration and this Constitution read aloud on the same day. You may not know quite what to believe about what's going to happen. The Declaration was also printed in newspapers beginning on Saturday, July 6th in Benjamin Town's Pennsylvania Evening Post. This was a tri-weekly evening newspaper, and Benjamin Town planned around the days of the week when the mail arrived in Philadelphia. So he was really trying to get the latest information in front of his readers. And so he printed the Declaration on the evening of July 6th. John Dunlap printed it in his newspaper on Monday, July 8th. And from there, it was printed in every active newspaper in the United States. So many people would have accessed the text in this way. The Declaration was also translated within days of July 4th. And as someone who had ancestors who were German living in the greater Philadelphia area, it gives me a fair amount of pride that there are German printings of the Declaration among the very first copies created. This is a broadside, so again, a poster-sized sheet. And the existence of a broadside in German, a broadside being something meant to be posted up in public spaces or used for public readings, suggests that the German immigrant communities wanted to have the Declaration read aloud in the language with which they operated in their daily lives. The Declaration was also printed in the biweekly German newspaper in Philadelphia, the Staatsbote. So there's this immigrant community that has the same access to the Declaration as their Anglophonic neighbors. And these German printings are an important reminder, though you'll see more evidence of this later, that the Declaration was immediately a multilingual document. Now, another one of my favorites is actually on view in the gallery. This is a broadside which was printed in Boston in mid-July 1776. At this time, and I have a whole chapter about this in the book, smallpox had taken over Boston. So if you were in Boston when the Declaration was news, you were either immune to smallpox or you were going through smallpox inoculation. So at a time when people believed that smallpox might spread through paper, we can assume that broadsides that were printed in Boston stayed in Boston. This particular example is really special because it's annotated. And I remember when I came to the JCB to do research, and I pulled this broadside based on a very scant old catalog listing, not expecting this, and then opened it up and realized, oh my goodness, it's annotated. So the list of grievances is numbered. And towards the end of the list of grievances, it says 25 and then 27 corrected to 26. We've all done that. But this shows close reading of the Declaration, someone sitting and processing each of the grievances about King George III. So the next question is, who did this? Who annotated the Declaration? Thankfully, we have the answer because Daniel Gould signed his name just below John Hancock. So you may be wondering, who's Daniel Gould? I was wondering this as well. Thankfully, again, he left us a note. So on the back of the Declaration, you can see it's been folded up, labeled, unfolded, folded back up, labeled again, unfolded. But some years later, Daniel Gould added this note. And he said, I bought this when the Declaration of Independence was first celebrated in Boston in the year 1776, and when I was a soldier in the American Army. If he had not left this note, I would have no idea which Daniel Gould this was. Gould is a popular surname in Massachusetts. It would have been impossible to track this story down. But because we have this note, we have this incredible example of a soldier engaging with the Declaration, someone fighting for independence, literally reading all the reasons why that fight was worthwhile. What I love about this note as well is he had this reason for being in Boston. So I was trying to research, well, which Daniel Gould was in Boston in July 1776 at a time when most of the Continental Army had moved on. If he had not been so specific, I would not have been able to solve the puzzle. It turns out that he was a lifeguard to Major General Artemus Ward, who was responsible for the remaining battalions left in the Boston area. And so that's why Gould was in Boston. He later sailed to New York with a bunch of cannon to help the Continental Army there. Another interesting aspect of this document, which came up in my research, is that it was literally carted out for the bicentennial of Daniel Gould's hometown of Topsfield, Massachusetts. So I found this record in a newspaper from 1850 describing how a wagon was rolled down the street as part of the parade celebrating the town's bicentennial. And though Gould had passed, obviously the document had descended in his family or his townspeople. And so on a long board displayed on the side of this wagon, there were a bunch of documents from early Massachusetts, including this copy of the Declaration. So it's an incredible, incredible story. I'm so pleased that we have it on view during the 250th for people to appreciate. Now, I said typos at the beginning. I love typos. There's a lot of examples of the Declaration that we could look to that have typos, which are evidence not necessarily of sloppy work, but of printers working with haste to get this important information out. Setting individual pieces of type in a dark printing office, you're going to make mistakes. The Massachusetts Spy has a lot of mistakes, unfortunately. The Massachusetts Spy for many years had been run by Isaiah Thomas, who literally wrote the book on printing in America. But just before the Declaration of Independence, he handed the reins of his paper over to two men who, by Thomas's account, were pretty terrible printers, and we can see the evidence of that in the Declaration. Just to point out a few examples, in the very famous second sentence of the Declaration, it says, "We hold these truths to us self-evident, not to be self-evident." And then they are endowed by their creatat instead of creator. And then in the final paragraph, it says, "the free and independent states." So none of these typos would have impacted the reader's experience too much, but they do tell us something about the process. Another notable typo is from right here in Rhode Island, and you can see the Solomon Southwick broadside on view here at the library, which Southwick dated June 13th, 1776. Obviously, the Declaration did not exist on that date. We've all done that. When the calendar changes and we start writing the wrong month, it's totally understandable. This was also Southwick's first attempt at printing broadsides of the Declaration. He was then assigned this task of printing official copies to be sent out to all of the towns in Rhode Island. And so he was able to correct his mistake and not print a date anymore at the bottom, along with instructions about how the Declaration should be read in Providence and Newport, and then in all of the other towns in Rhode Island. Now, speaking about the Declaration in Providence, one of the last chapters that I wrote for the book, it actually was not part of my dissertation, it was something I added just before the book manuscript was ready. It's about Anglican ministers. I never expected to have a chapter about Anglican ministers in my book about the Declaration, but I found that the papers of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel were a treasure trove of individual ministers responding to the Declaration of Independence, and the impact on their individual lives is incredible. So the image I'm showing you here is from the Book of Common Prayer for Christ Church in Philadelphia. This was the first place where Anglican congregations had to respond to the Declaration of Independence because it literally happened down the street. And so you can see here that the prayers for King George III and the royal family on July 4th were crossed out and replaced with prayers for the Continental Congress. So you can see the long black lines stretching through these prayers. This was one strategy for dealing with independence as an Anglican minister. You change the prayers. So instead of praying for the king to vanquish his enemies, you strategically change it, either cutting it altogether or changing the subject of the prayer. Other ministers made different choices. In some cases, some Anglican ministers were defiant. They had sworn an oath at their ordination to the king as the head of the Church of England. And for a political change that might ultimately prove to be temporary, not all of them were willing to violate the Book of Common Prayer. But another sort of middle course, which ultimately a lot of ministers pursued, was to close their churches. And so you have these three options of changing the Book of Common Prayer, closing your church, or just sticking with it and hoping for the best. Here in Providence, John Graves, who was the minister of King's Church, he opted for that middle course of closing his church, but only after his congregation threatened him. They sent him a letter just before the Declaration of Independence with a veiled threat against him and his family, including his 7 children, if he continued to pray for the king. Graves responded on the same day that the Declaration was printed in the newspaper here in Providence, and he basically said, I had this whole speech letter in mind defending myself, and then I saw the Declaration of Independence, and so I'm just going to close my church. It's not going to be worth the violence to my family. So it's really an interesting example of people caught in a really unfortunate situation, trying to make the best of it, unable to communicate with other ministers or with the secretary of the SPG back in London. Another interesting story about the sort of timing of the Declaration's arrival comes from Watertown, Massachusetts, where the first formal acknowledgement of the United States by a foreign power happened because the Declaration arrived in the middle of a treaty meeting between the state of Massachusetts and chiefs from the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq nations up in like New Brunswick and Maine. They had come down to Boston hoping to meet with George Washington. Boston has smallpox, George Washington's in New York, so the Massachusetts government scrambles to organize this treaty meeting. And the Declaration arrives in the middle of it, and it is translated into French for the chiefs who know that language and can further translate into Algonquin languages. And then Chief Ambrose Bear, whose pictogram you can see at the top left here, he responded, at least according to the treaty minutes, "We like it well." And those 4 words mark the first acknowledgement of independence by a foreign power. And it doesn't come from France, it doesn't come from the other side of the Atlantic, it comes from our indigenous neighbors. The last paragraph of the Declaration was incorporated into the first paragraph of this treaty, and then you can see the signatures of the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik chiefs here, 3 of whom actually jumped out of their seats offering to go to New York to fight alongside George Washington as soon as possible. Another great story about the Declaration is actually on the walls of the Museum of the American Revolution right now. One of the real joys of working on the book was simultaneously working on this exhibit as part of the curatorial team. And so when you walk into the exhibit, some of the things that are in the book are on the walls, which is really thrilling, including Jonas Phillips, whose portrait you can see here, along with one of those Dunlap broadsides, the first printing of the Declaration, and a few other documents on loan from the British National Archives. We really should have Jonas's wife, Rebecca's portrait on view too. Jonas Phillips came to North America as an indentured servant. After he worked off his indenture, he moved to New York and married Rebecca, and she came from a prominent Sephardic Jewish family. And so he used her connections to establish a mercantile business, first in New York and then in Philadelphia, and then became one of the sort of Jewish leaders of Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. So Rebecca deserves some credit. They also had 21 children, so she deserves some credit for that too. Now, Jonas Phillips, the reason why he's part of this exhibit is he sent a copy of the Declaration of Independence to a relative and fellow merchant in Amsterdam. And he sent it through the Dutch Caribbean to the island of St. Eustatius, because at this time there's British ships patrolling the Atlantic. So in an effort to try to make sure that his copy of the Declaration reached its destination, he sends it to St. Eustatius. We know it got there. The letter that he enclosed the Declaration in is franked by the mercantile contact on St. Eustatius. But sometime after it left the island, it was intercepted by a British ship. And so it never reached its intended destination, which means that this copy of the Declaration has lived in the intercepted papers in the British National Archives ever since. This is the letter that Jonas Phillips sent enclosing the Declaration. And I know it's hard to see on the screen, so let me zoom in. Is that better? No. That's because Jonas Phillips wrote this letter in Yiddish. So he wrote this letter in a language that he knew and that his recipient would know, but no one who intercepted it would know. And we know that this was an intentional choice because at one point Jonas Phillips says, "I could explain myself better in English." So he definitely was intentionally writing in Yiddish. Now, if you were a British officer on a ship in the Atlantic and you intercept a letter written in what kind of looks like code, dated Philadelphia, July 1776, enclosing the Declaration of Independence, you might think you hit the jackpot, that this is like some real spycraft. Unfortunately, no, it's just a letter about Jonas Phillips's family, his business, his initial impressions of independence. And he just hoped that it would reach its destination and took every effort, and ultimately, unfortunately, it did not. And so you can see here his broadside is stamped Her Majesty's State Paper Office. In fact, the British National Archives have one of the best collections of copies of the Declaration because so many ended up in British hands. A final footnote on this story is that Jonas and Rebecca Phillips's daughter, Rachel, had a son named Uriah Phillips Levy, who was a Commodore in the Navy, and he purchased Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation to save it from falling into ruin. So Jonas and Rebecca's daughter, Rachel, actually lived the final years of her life at Monticello, and she's buried there. So it's this strange connection across the generations of this Jewish family to the Declaration. Now, the story of Jonas Phillips's copy of the Declaration helps to inform what happened to Silas Deane. Silas Deane was the Continental Congress's agent in France. He arrived in France in July 1776 to try to soften the ground for a French alliance with the United Colonies. Unfortunately for Silas Deane, by the time he was able to present a copy of the Declaration at the court of Versailles, it was November of 1776. And he wrote back to Philadelphia that it had indeed become an old story in every part of Europe. So what happened? How did Silas Deane not get a copy of the Declaration until November? Well, the Congress sent him a copy within a few days of July 4th, but it was thrown overboard. So they had given instructions to the ship captain carrying this package of information for Silas Deane They had given instructions that if he met with a British vessel, he should pitch it overboard. And the ship had not even left the Delaware River and gotten to the Atlantic Ocean when a British ship approached, and over the Declaration went. And so the unfortunate side effect of this for the Continental Congress is that the news of independence spread to Europe via British mail ships. So British mail ships left New York about a week after the Declaration of Independence was approved, sailed over to England, where the Declaration was printed in London beginning on August 16th, and then from there it spread to the rest of Europe. And that's how it became an old story, spreading all around Silas Deane before he had an actual copy from Philadelphia. This is the first printing in London on August 16th. Henry Sampson Woodfall had actually forewarned his readers the day before that the Declaration would be in the next day's issue. So it seemed like he had some sort of special access to the text. And he printed the Declaration in full. And then that evening, another newspaper printed the Declaration not in full. So you can see here that certain references to the king have been replaced with long dashes. So that should read the history of the present king of Great Britain. This is one of a number of different censorship strategies employed for a document that is ultimately all about King George III, which makes it a challenge to print in London. However, there were people in London who supported independence, and we have the evidence of that here. This is a broadside printed in London, bearing a portrait of John Hancock at the top. And what I've highlighted here is the evidence of how we know that this was printed in London. There's this switcheroo in one of the grievances where the phrase acts of pretended legislation changes to pretended acts of legislation, somewhere between New York and London. Whether it was a manuscript copy or one of the first newspapers, this error enters the process and is repeated in every British edition of the text. So that's how we know that this was definitely printed in London and nowhere in the United States. As you can see, there's this portrait of John Hancock at the top, which makes this broadside especially interesting because, as I mentioned, broadsides are meant to be posted up in public spaces. So clearly there were people in London who were excited about independence enough to have not only the text, but a nice big portrait of John Hancock at the top with a liberty cap and olive branches, kind of symbolizing his role as an enlightened leader of the Continental Congress. This engraving is based on a mezzotint, which was first printed in London in 1775, because there was quite a bit of curiosity about this merchant turned head of the Continental Congress in London. It's based on John Singleton Copley's portrait of Hancock, but it's also kind of uniquely London. And so I love this broadside, and the JCB's copy is the only one that survives with the portrait of Hancock at the top. The Library Company in Philadelphia also has this broadside, but the portrait has been cut off of it. Now, if we go across the English Channel, we can see how the changes made to the Declaration impacted the way it was printed in the rest of Europe. Just to give one example, this is a newspaper in Haarlem in the Dutch Republic. And you can see in the excerpt I've shown, there's some asterisks and a long dash replacing those references to the king. And then in a bracketed note to the reader, there's something which we see in some London newspapers, which is printers just skipped over the list of grievances and summarized them saying, here the colonists repeated their previous complaints about the king. And so we see that replicated in the Dutch newspaper. Unfortunately for Johannes and Schede, his readers actually wanted to see the list of grievances. So in the next issue, he had to print an apology to his readers saying, I didn't realize you wanted to see the complaints from the English colonies, the grievances about the king, so I will print them for you now. But because he had censored those references to the king, in the first grievance, he had to explain what he was, what the pronoun was in the list of grievances. So he has to say he, and then in parentheses, namely the king. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that the period of time when the Declaration was news concludes in January 1777. And the reason for that is this broadside printing by Mary Catherine Goddard in Baltimore. Printed in Baltimore because by that time, the Continental Congress had evacuated Philadelphia for fear of a British attack. And this is the first printing to have the names of all of the men who had signed the parchment copy of the Declaration by that time. I say by that time because Thomas McKean of Delaware had not yet signed the parchment. And so there's only 55 names on Goddard's broadside. And this kind of dogged McKean in his political career, that his name was on some copies of the Declaration and not others, to the point that he actually had to go to the State Department and look at the parchment and say, see, I really did sign the thing. Goddard's printings were sent out to each of the states with the intention of forming the foundation of each state's archive. So here is Rhode Island's Goddard broadside. This is sort of before and after of some conservation work that has been done recently. You can see how the paper had become so brittle that it had basically fractured into 3 pieces over time. And so that has been beautifully conserved, and now it's not only restored, but it's going on tour here in Rhode Island for the 250th. But there's one thing that happened to this particular Goddard broadside which could not be fixed. And when I saw this in the Rhode Island State Archives, it truly shocked me. At the bottom, Mary Catherine Goddard's name is crossed out. I haven't seen this on any other imprint of the Declaration. This is the only time I've ever seen this, complete erasure of the printer. And it's astonishing, both because why would you do that? And we don't know exactly when, this ink line was drawn through, but also because Goddard had chosen to print her full name at the bottom of this document. She typically printed under her initials, M.K. Goddard. But here she prints her full name, Mary Catherine Goddard, as if she too is pledging her life, her fortune, and her sacred honor to the cause of independence at a time when it's not looking so great for the Continental Army. The book leaves off on a cliffhanger. You don't know if the United States is going to survive. So this was an incredibly brave act by Goddard, which has been erased on this broadside from the colony turned state where she actually developed her printing career. So it's a sad sort of footnote to this story. But I hope that we give Goddard her due as we approach the 250th of her printing in January 2027. If all of these stories have made you interested in the book, you are welcome to purchase a copy. If you order directly from Oxford, you can get a 30% discount. You're also welcome, of course, to purchase from your local bookstores. And as Karen mentioned, I am on the road a lot between now and July 4th and even after. And you can find out more about upcoming dates at emilysneff.com. And I would be happy to chat with you all and to take a look at the documents that we have on view here. Thank you so much. Any questions?
You mentioned that the convention had the 3 primary responsibilities,
Yes.
the Declaration, the Confederation, and the drafting of treaties that took an extra 1.5 or 2 years to actually get done. Were those treaties done in template, fill in the blank for which royal highness of which good Catholic
Exactly.
monarchy and things?
Yes.
And they are going to be asking those sovereigns, those monarchies, to join this rejection of the whole,
monarchy,
of the
yes.
whole principle. That requires some pretty effective diplomacy to sell this product and try to get the signature of their host.
Yes.
Were there any comments by those representatives saying, can I adjust my instructions? Or
That's a great question. Yes, so the model treaty was essentially, Mad Libs, fill in, His Most Christian Majesty, X name. Another treaty which was enacted in 1778 was the Treaty of Fort Pitt, which would be with indigenous allies, so that looked a little different. But the ones for European nations, yes, there's very much this sort of irony of getting other kings on board with this anti-monarchy effort. we don't have too many reactions from 1776 from different royals in Europe. I wish we had more. I think there was a lot of trepidation about whether the Continental Army could actually secure independence. And so that's why we see a delay in actual execution of treaties. One example of someone in the courts of Europe responding to the declaration in real time is actually the Prince of Orange in the Netherlands. And when he read the declaration, he said it was just a ripoff of the act of abjuration, which his ancestors had done against Spain when the Dutch Republic separated from Spain centuries earlier. So that's the one reaction that we do have in 1776.
Hi, thank you. That was fascinating, and I'm looking forward to reading the full book. I'm interested in Solomon Southwick, and the first time that he mentions the Declaration of Independence in the Newport Mercury, he has a short notice that says there is a declaration, and I'm going to print it in a forthcoming issue of the newspaper, but I'm also going to create a broadside. And when he does print it in the newspaper, he doesn't quite manage to get it on a single page.
Yeah.
It overflows just a little bit. And I've been convinced that he does that in part because he doesn't want to damage demand for those who are going to publish or purchase the broadside.
Yeah.
And you skirted around a few times. You mentioned commodification of the Declaration, but I was wondering if you discuss commodification of the Declaration in the book, or if you could reflect on the commodification of the Declaration for a couple of moments with
Absolutely. Yeah, there's these broadsides created for official purposes, and then there is certainly broadsides created as commodities, as things for the printer's audience, but hopefully more people than that to purchase. So we see some cases of, like John Holt in New York, he prints the Declaration intentionally on one sheet and gives instructions saying you can separate this out and post it up in your home, for pride about independence. Of course, if you're in New York, it's not going to last for long because the British are coming. So we have examples of that. I think you're right that there's certain printers who, because they have both the broadsides they're trying to sell and the newspaper version, and their printing offices are kind of split between responsibilities. I could see that being a reason why it sort of goes on to page 2 a little bit. We have other examples, even starting with John Dunlap. There's one of the Dunlap broadsides, which is in the British National Archives. The imprint is changed from Philadelphia to Baltimore, where Dunlap had a second location of his printing office. That tells me that he recognized the opportunity for commodifying this product, which he had fulfilled his order for the Continental Congress and then was like, let me see if I can sell a few of these in Baltimore. So we don't have nearly as much evidence as I would hope for. I've had a lot of people ask me how much the Declaration would have been to purchase one of these broadsides. And to my knowledge, we just don't have evidence of that pricing. But certainly I think we could see this is an opportunity not just for spreading the news for the civic good, but also taking the opportunity to sell copies. I would imagine the broadsides printed in London were saleable. We just don't have the evidence of how much or to whom. Thank you.
Who's responsible for the dissemination? Who was responsible for the dissemination of the Declaration? Was it the delegates, the delegations, or how organized was it? And also, what led to time lags? Because clearly getting something to New York would take a lot less than to Boston.
Exactly, yeah. In terms of how organized was it, the answer is not very. So the initial sort of dissemination by the Congress is done by John Hancock. So he sits down beginning on July 5th with, we can imagine, a stack of Dunlap broadsides, and his secretary, Jacob Rush, the younger brother of Benjamin Rush. They're sending out letters to George Washington, to each of the states. So we know that that is part of the strategy. But even at the end of the day, John Hancock starts writing letters to his friends in his own hand, sending off copies of the Declaration. So that's how it would have gotten to the states, but it also would have spread through newspaper networks of printers sending their newspapers to each other, which was a typical practice. There's certain delegates who send copies of the Declaration to their home states, not necessarily hoping it'll be the first arrival of the news, but in some cases it might have been. In the case of my book, it actually begins with a woman named Polly Palmer, to whom John Adams sent one of the first printings of the Declaration, not because she was a newsmaker who was going to get it in front of the people as soon as possible, but because she was a friend who he was corresponding with, and it just, it's a coincidence of timing that he sent it to her. Once the Declaration reaches each of the states, it's the state's responsibility to decide how to disseminate the news. So in some cases, you have states where they order public readings on a set date or by a set person. In other states, including Connecticut, they just say, whatever, people will find out about it, like either because the assembly is not in session or because they can't make a decision about a dissemination path. So a lot of the evidence that we would hope for of a organized dissemination strategy is just not there. And you wonder, I had this conversation with Liz Covart on Ben Franklin's World about whether the Continental Congress needed a PR person, someone actually keeping a strategy, and it probably could have been someone like Ben Franklin who had knowledge of both print experience and diplomacy. So yeah, not as organized as you would hope. Another question?
That was great. Thank you so much. My question is about, after the Declaration of Independence becomes this like public-facing, appears in all the newspapers and broadsides, to what extent do other phases of this also meet with the same attention? So like the Articles of Confederation that you mentioned. And you also, I think you mentioned that it didn't really work out the way it was intended, and so the Constitution has maybe come to replace those, but I don't know. So if you could just speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, I think the Constitution would be a closer analog. Different because it's a decade later, but John Dunlap's the first printer of that as well, along with his printing partner at the time. And that's another text that it was printed in all the newspapers. Like that was a strategy of getting the word out. The Constitution's a lot longer of a document, not something you want to listen to read aloud, whereas the Declaration is like a tight 15 minutes, 20 minutes experience of hearing it read aloud. The resolution which begins the book, the May 15th resolution, I initially thought of that as a case study, exactly like you're talking about. Like, where are these other moments where the Continental Congress is issuing a pivotal text and it needs to be communicated to the people, and what does that look like? How does it travel across the Atlantic? And I shared what I thought was a separate piece, like an article separate from the book, with our writing group in grad school. And everyone at once said, this is chapter 1, like this has to be part of the Declaration's story. So yeah, I wish there were more clear kind of one-for-one comparisons to these, this is a media moment. And unfortunately, it's kind of, state constitutions, but only within that state. There's not really a close comparison. Another major media moment would be Washington's farewell address, which is both printed quite a lot and also printed alongside the Declaration. So it was definitely thought of in the public consciousness as a similar document.
Hi, Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. To follow up on the commodity maybe a little bit, I have a question about the materiality of posting broadsides.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I see people post paper nowadays, it's either like push pins or maybe wheat pasting, both of which are pretty destructive. Are these being posted in less destructive ways back then, or are the broadsides that survive ones that were saved rather than posted, or some other possibility I'm not thinking of? Thank you.
No, that's a great question. In a lot of cases, the margins of surviving copies have been cut down. So we could assume that there was some sort of damage around the exterior. In the case of the London broadside here, that was actually folded up and pasted into a volume. So it was then cut out, and that's why it looks kind of wonky. The one broadside where I have seen evidence of something in the four corners, which seems to be wax based on the British National Archives expertise, is Jonas Phillips's broadside, which to me suggests that he had a shop right down the street from John Dunlap's printing office, and this was a broadside which was posted up somewhere, maybe in his shop, maybe elsewhere. And then as he wrote this letter to his relative, he took down the broadside, folded it up, and put it in the mail. I think you're right that there are probably, to a degree, in the same way that a lot of the surviving newspapers were from the printer's own sort of record keeping, I could see how some of the surviving broadsides were not the ones that were posted up, that those were the most ephemeral, the most likely to either get torn down or be too damaged to preserve. In some cases, we have broadsides that, like Daniel Gould's, have a story on the back, some sort of message about who owned this, where they had it. Sometimes that's added way later and we can't really trust it. But yeah, I think we can assume that there was some sort of perhaps destructive means of, or maybe not, super conservation-minded means of posting the Declaration up. But at the end of the day, this is all words on paper. I mean, it's not meant to survive. That's why we have the parchment copy, because they recognized at the time paper's just not going to make it. So the survivals that we do have are incredible.
So you spoke at the beginning about the careful intention behind the choice of names on the Declaration, right? Some names were added even though they weren't there. Some names are excluded, like that you might expect, like Paine. But later, when the copies you showed of the printing, right, most of them don't include any names other than Hancock's.
Exactly.
So how should we interpret that choice? What goes into that decision?
Yeah, so when the Declaration is printed, the only names that accompany it are Hancock as president and Charles Thompson as the secretary of the Continental Congress. And that's a sort of attestation that this is the official word of the Congress. Then when the Declaration's printed in places like Newport, Rhode Island, it's then further attested to by the state secretary. So those are the names we see on the printed copies. The list of names on the parchment are just delegates who over time were allowed to sign, whether they were part of the process of deliberating about the Declaration or not, including like Matthew Thornton, who came from New Hampshire, didn't show up to the Congress until November, and he was still allowed to sign because it's this sort of pledge in addition to being a sort of moment of political change. So the first printings with the names of the signers revealed for the first time how many delegates and the kind of arrangement of things. But everyone knew who their representatives were in Philadelphia, so they could kind of guess who had signed and who hadn't. So. One more?
Oh, sorry, just really quickly.
You're good.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, I think you briefly covered this already, but you mentioned that most of the signatories were actually in the room on June 28th, and then June 4th was kind of arbitrarily chosen. Just if you could go over a little bit again why July 4th was the definitive date. And also I was wondering, I'm not from here, I'm not from the US, but I recently learned about this act of renunciation that was passed in Rhode Island, and it was like May 1st. And so I was wondering why you didn't begin the tracing on May 1st and instead with May 15th.
No, good question. So I was at the Rhode Island Historical Society on May 4th and had to explain myself why the book starts in May but not in Rhode Island. And the reason for that is because there are all these things that are happening outside of Philadelphia simultaneously to the Congress's conversations, but they don't know about them yet. So there's no through line from the decision made in Rhode Island to the denunciation to the May 15th resolution. The Congress found out about it probably on May 14th, by which time they had already agreed on this path toward the resolution. So that's why the book doesn't begin in Rhode Island, though it certainly could. In terms of the timeline, so June 28th is when the Congress receives the draft declaration to be ready for, if they vote to declare independence, then they can turn their attention to the draft. The debate about whether or not to declare independence resumes on Monday, July 1st, after a 3-week postponement in an effort to try to make sure that the people were being represented in the decision. They don't reach a decision in one day. So July 2nd is the day when the Continental Congress votes to declare independence, and then they take about a day and a half to work on the declaration, which they approve on July 4th. So that's the sort of timeline of things. which is typically the focus of all the other books on the Declaration, and for my book, it is not. It's a part of one chapter, and the rest of the time is focused outside of Independence Hall on what the people thought about the Declaration. So thank you all so much, and please enjoy the reception and all of the documents.